They found her body at dawn, still dressed in wedding gold, eyes open but unseeing. The physicians wrote natural causes. But in the coded journal hidden beneath her pillow, Princess Layla Sultan had scratched a single word in blood: forgive. For 6 centuries, the Ottoman Empire celebrated its royal weddings as symbols of power and prosperity. But behind the silk curtains of Topkapi Palace, these ceremonies concealed a horror so systematic, so calculated, that even the empire's enemies never suspected it existed. 3:47 a.m., March 15th, 1623. The scream came from the East Wing. Aishi, the servant girl carrying linens, dropped everything. Her hands went to her ears, but the sound cut through anyway. Not pain, worse than pain, terror. Pick those up. Chief Eunuch Suleiman materialized from the shadows. His voice never rose. It never had to. Sir, no one needs anything. He stepped closer. You heard a cat, a night bird, nothing. Do you understand? Aisha's mouth opened, closed. She understood perfectly. Some screams the palace pretends don't exist. She gathered the linens with shaking hands and ran. Later in the servants' quarters, she would tell the others what Chief Eunuch said, and they would nod because they'd all heard screams like that before. Every royal wedding, same sound, different princess. But this story doesn't start with the scream. It starts 6 months earlier with a girl who made the fatal mistake of being brilliant. October 1622. The Harem Gardens. Late afternoon. You're doing it wrong. Layla Sultan looked up from her notebook. Her sister Fatma stood there, 11 years old and holding a tray of honey cakes, like a peace offering. I'm calculating Venus's trajectory. There's no wrong way. Not the math, your life. Fatma sat down, crushing jasmine beneath her silk trousers. Grandmother says you ask too many questions. Grandmother thinks women shouldn't read. Grandmother survived 3 sultans by knowing when to stop reading. Fatma pushed the cakes closer. Eat, you're thin. Layla took one without tasting it. Her mind was still on the numbers, 3 months of tracking, and the pattern was emerging. If she was right, she could predict flooding seasons, predict harvests. Maybe even, they're choosing your husband today. The honey cake turned to paste in Layla's mouth. What? Father's counsel. Right now, Mother told me this morning. Fatma wouldn't meet her eyes. She said I should prepare you. Prepare me for what? I'm 14 and 2 months, old enough. Fatma's voice cracked. Layla, please, stop looking at the stars. Start looking at what's coming. But Layla was already running. She made it to the 3rd courtyard before the guards caught her gently, professionally, like they'd done this 100 times before. Because they had. Chief Eunuch Suleiman arrived moments later. Walk with me, princess. It wasn't a request. They moved through corridors Layla had known since childhood. But today they felt different. Narrower. The walls seemed to lean in. When I was 9, Suleiman said quietly, they took me from my village in Georgia. I tried to escape 17 times that first year. Layla's breath was still ragged. Did you ever make it? No. On the 18th attempt, I stopped trying. Do you know why? Because you gave up. Because I learned the difference between a battle you can win and a battle that wins nothing but more pain. He stopped walking. Your father's council has chosen Kara Mustafa Pasha, 32 years old, successful commander, politically neutral. The marriage happens in 5 months. I know what you want, princess. I also know what you'll learn, that wanting is the first freedom they take. His eyes held something ancient. The question isn't whether you'll marry him. The question is whether you'll survive what comes before. He left her at her mother's chambers. Layla pushed the door open without knocking. Kusum Sultan's private rooms. Evening. Her mother sat surrounded by ledgers, accounts from 3 provinces, trade agreements, military requisitions. Running an empire from a room men would never see. Mother, I need to talk about Kara Mustafa Pasha. Yes. You'll meet him once before the wedding. The contracts are being finalized. Kosem didn't look up. I don't want this. Now her mother's pen stopped. She set it down with surgical precision. Want. That word again. Kosem finally looked at her daughter. Do you know what I wanted at your age? To see my family one more time, to remember my real name, to not be sold into slavery and forced to bear children for a man who couldn't remember which concubine I was. That's different. It's exactly the same. I survived by understanding the empire isn't built on what we want. It's built on what we surrender. Kosem's voice softened, which somehow made it worse. You think I'm cruel. I'm not. I'm realistic. Your grandmother was married at 12. She told me the first year she cried so hard she damaged her own throat. Couldn't speak for months. You want to know what they called it? Layla said nothing. Piety. Silent devotion. They gave her poetry awards. Kosem returned to her ledgers. You have 5 months to prepare. Use them. The alternative is spending your wedding night like Grandmother Silent because you destroyed yourself screaming. There has to be another way. There isn't. There never was. There never will be. Kosem's hand trembled slightly as she wrote. Tomorrow you begin Terbiye-i Mubarak, the sacred education. I suggest you cooperate. The girls who fight it only make it worse. What happens in the sacred education? For the first time, Kosem's face showed something other than steel. Fear, maybe, or memory. You'll learn what every sultan's daughter learns. How to disappear while still breathing. Day 1, the Eastern Wing, dawn. The corridor smelled wrong. Not perfume and incense like the rest of the palace. Something medicinal. Sterile. Mistress Hurrem waited at an unmarked door. She was maybe 50, maybe 70, the kind of old that comes from witnessing things that age you from the inside. Princess Layla Sultan, welcome to your education. I don't need... The slap came fast, not hard enough to bruise, hard enough to shock. First lesson, you speak when spoken to. Second lesson, you are spoken to only when you have something correct to say. Third lesson, you rarely have anything correct to say. Mistress Hurrem opened the door. Inside. The room was 10 feet square. No windows. One oil lamp. A wooden chair that had worn grooves where thousands of hands had gripped it. 3 other girls sat on floor mats. All princesses. All engaged. All terrified. You will learn 18 postures of submission, Mistress Hurrem announced. Each represents a different form of obedience to husband, to Allah, to sultan, to empire. You will practice 8 hours daily. Mistakes add hours. Complaints add days. This is insane, Layla whispered. Mistress Hurrem smiled. That's not on the list of sanctioned words. Would you like to learn about the silence chamber? One of the other girls, Aisha Sultan from Trabzon, grabbed Layla's hand, squeezed once. A warning. No, mistress, Layla said. Good. Kneel. They knelt. Forehead to ground. Hold 20 minutes. Begin. Jed. Week 4. The vocabulary lessons. From today you speak only these 43 phrases. Mistress Hurrem handed out scrolls. Layla read the list. Her hands started shaking. Yes, my lord. As you wish. Forgive my ignorance. Thank you for your guidance. I exist to serve. 43 ways to erase your own voice. This is... Layla caught herself. She'd almost said wrong. That wasn't on the list. You want to say it's cruel. Mistress Hurrem circled her like a shark. You want to say it's dehumanizing. You want to say 1,000 things. But here's what the empire knows that you don't. Words are power. Take away the words, you take away the rebellion. But how do we... Layla checked the list. Nothing about asking questions. Nothing about expressing needs. She tried again. Forgive my ignorance, but how does one communicate? You don't. You respond. There's a difference. Mistress Hurrem clapped her hands. Pair practice. Aisha Sultan, you'll be the husband. Layla Sultan, you'll be the wife. Begin. Aisha looked miserable. Tell me about your day. Layla opened her mouth, closed it. Nothing on the list fit. Forgive my ignorance, my lord. I asked about your day, not, thank you for your guidance, my lord. That doesn't even... I exist to serve, my lord. Mistress Hurram nodded approvingly. Good. You're learning. When there's no correct answer, default to submission. Your husband isn't looking for conversation. He's looking for confirmation that you know your place. Layla felt something crack inside her chest. Not breaking yet, just the first fracture. But it would spread. Week 7. The concubine lessons. They were led deeper into the East Wing, to chambers Layla had never known existed, inside 12 of her father's concubines in various states of undress being bathed by servants. Watch, Mistress Hurram commanded. See how they move, how they please without speaking. You are learning their grace without their shame. This is humiliating, one of the other princesses whispered. No, this is education and hierarchy. You think because you're born royal, you're above these women. Mistress Hurram grabbed the girl's chin, forced her to look. They're slaves who've mastered survival. You're princesses who need to learn, who's actually superior. For 2 hours they watched, learned, practiced on each other until the movements became automatic. How to pour tea with deference, how to walk without sound, how to shrink yourself so completely that your presence became a comfort rather than a distraction. Layla caught the eye of one concubine, a woman maybe 25, still beautiful, completely empty. The woman mouthed 2 words, save yourself, but there was nowhere to run. So, week 9. Night. Layla's cell. She couldn't sleep. Hadn't really slept in weeks. Behind a loose stone near her mat, she'd hidden a small journal smuggled by Fatma during a rare visit. Every night, Layla recorded what was happening, not because she thought anyone would read it, because forgetting felt worse than documenting. Tonight's entry. They're not teaching us to be wives. They're teaching us to be furniture. Decorative, useful, silent. Aisha Sultan broke today. Not dramatically. Quietly. She just stopped resisting. Started saying, yes, mistress, before Mistress Hurram even finished questions. Her eyes went flat. I asked her later, are you okay? She used the sanctioned words, thank you for your concern, princess. Even with me. Even when no one was watching. That's when I understood they don't need the silence chamber. We build our own chambers, in our heads, where no one can hear us scream. She closed the journal. Tomorrow was week 10. Tomorrow, the underground rooms. The underground training. Week 10. The room no one speaks about. Final preparation, Mistress Hurram announced. What you learn tonight stays here. What you feel tonight stays here. What you become tonight is all that matters. They descended stairs older than the palace above them. Stone gave way to rougher stone. The air grew cold. At the bottom, a chamber lit by 20 oil lamps. In its center, a bed covered in red silk. Around the bed, 5 mannequins carved from ivory. Articulated. Disturbingly anatomically correct. 3 physicians waited women, which somehow made it worse. Their faces held the expression of people who'd stopped feeling decades ago. The Sultan's daughter must understand her wedding night duties, the head physician said. She could have been reading a recipe. This is clinical instruction. You will not speak. You will not cry. Tears suggest misunderstanding of the honor being bestowed. What happened next is documented in medical archives written in coded Persian. The Ottoman court physician Ahmed Effendi later described these sessions in his restricted journal. The preparation of royal daughters follows Byzantine precedent, systematic desensitization to marital duties through graduated exposure and controlled instruction. He never used the word trauma. But in 2019, when historians finally accessed these documents, psychologist Dr. Elif Shafak would write, what these texts describe is not education, it's conditioning. Specifically, it's the systematic destruction of bodily autonomy disguised as medical training. 3 hours passed. Layla didn't remember most of it. Her mind went somewhere else, a trick she'd learned without being taught. One moment she was in her body, the next she was watching from the corner of the ceiling, seeing a girl who looked like her being handled like an anatomical model. When it ended, Mistress Hurram helped her stand. How do you feel? Layla checked her list of sanctioned words. Found one that fit. Thank you for your guidance, mistress. Mistress Hurram's face showed something almost like grief. You learn fast. That's good. The smart ones survive better. Survive what? Tomorrow. March 14th, 1623, the day before. Layla's final conversation. Fatma was allowed one last visit. She brought honey cakes that neither of them would eat. "You look different," Fatma whispered. "I'm the same." "No, your eyes, they're—" Fatma started crying. "I'm sorry. I shouldn't have said anything about the wedding. If I'd stayed quiet, maybe—" It wouldn't have mattered. They'd already decided. Layla took her sister's hand. "Listen, when I'm gone, find the loose stone behind my sleeping mat. There's a journal. Read it. Remember it. But don't show Mother." "Why?" "Because she already knows. That's worse than not knowing. She knows, and she sent me anyway." Layla's voice stayed flat. "Promise me something." "Anything. When they come for you, because they will run. Don't stop running until they put you in the silence chamber. Even then, keep running in your mind. Don't do what I did." "What did you do?" "I learned the words. I wore the grooves in the chair. I became what they wanted because I thought it would hurt less." Layla looked at her sister, really looked at her maybe for the last time. "It doesn't hurt less. It just hurts differently. You feel yourself disappearing and you can't even scream because you've forgotten how." Fatma gripped her hands tighter. "Can I tell you a secret? I'm not going to let them do this to me. When my time comes, I'm going to—" "Don't tell me. If you tell me, I'll have to report it. They've trained us that well." Layla pulled away. "Just promise you'll try. Promise someone will remember that we tried." The guards came then. Visiting time was over. As Fatma left, she looked back once. Layla was already standing in position, 3 hands folded, eyes lowered, face empty. The perfect princess. The perfect bride. The perfect ghost. March 15th, 1623. 2:00 a.m. The Preparation Pavilion. They came for her in darkness. First floor ritual purification. 3 hours of bathing in water mixed with sedative herbs. The steam made everything soft and distant. "Drink this," a physician said, offering a cup. Layla drank. The list didn't include questions about medicine. Second floor dressing. The wedding gown weighed 40 pounds, silk gold thread, hidden weights sewn into the hem. Beauty as restraint. "Can you breathe?" someone asked. "Yes, my lord," Layla said automatically. "I'm not a lord. I'm a seamstress." But Layla's mind was already fogging. The drink. Something in the steam. She felt herself being moved, arranged, decorated. Third floor, the bridal chamber. Kara Mustafa Pasha waited. She'd seen him once before at the contract signing. He'd looked uncomfortable then. Now he looked resigned. They were both prisoners of this. That was the only thing they'd ever have in common. The witnesses positioned themselves behind screens. The physicians opened their notebooks. Someone said a prayer. And at 3:47 a.m. the scream came. Not defiance, not pain. Recognition. The recognition that everything Mistress Hurrem said was true. That the empire doesn't break its daughters with cruelty. It breaks them with preparation. So thorough, so complete, that when the final moment comes, you already know there's no escape. You've already escaped the only way possible, by leaving your body behind. Narrator's voice quiet, but steady. In the morning, the palace celebrated another successful alliance. The physicians recorded, consummation completed per protocol, minor shock symptoms expected and normal. They used the term ruhun chikmasa, the departure of the soul, like it was a medical condition, not a murder. But here's what the official records don't tell you. Layla Sultan lived for 29 more years. She attended ceremonies. She bore 3 children. She was praised for her piety and silence, and she never in 3 decades spoke a word that wasn't on the list. The girl who charted stars died on her wedding night. What survived wore her name like a costume. This is the story of that death. And of the 1,000 deaths just like it. The empire called them weddings. History called them duty. But the princesses knew the truth. They called them nothing at all, because they'd forgotten how to speak. The journal survived because no one thought to look for it. 3 days after the wedding, when Layla was moved to her husband's estate outside Istanbul, a young cleaning girl named Zeynep found the loose stone. She couldn't read Ottoman Turkish well, but she recognized pain in any language. She hid the journal in her own belongings, carried it through 40 years of palace service, and on her deathbed, gave it to her daughter with one instruction: someone needs to know what they did to those girls. But we're getting ahead of ourselves, because to understand why Layla's wedding night happened, we need to go back further. To the woman who designed the entire system, the woman who believed she was saving princesses, not destroying them. Her name was Safiye Sultan, and in 1582 she made a decision that would haunt 6 generations. Kosem found her grandmother in the rose garden 3 weeks after Layla's wedding. The old woman sat feeding pigeons, her hands steady, despite being 87. "She won't speak," Kosem said without preamble. "Not even to her own children. The physicians say it's temporary." "The physicians are liars." Safiye scattered more seed. "It's not temporary. I've seen it before. 37 times before." Kosem went very still. "What did you say?" "Sit down, child. I'm old enough to tell you the truth now." Safiye's voice carried the weight of decades. "You think you invented Terbiye Mubarak. You think this started with you. You wrote the protocols. In 1582, Kosem had read the founding documents. After Princess Mihrimah's scandal, after Mihrimah slit her wrists on her wedding night and nearly destroyed an alliance with the Safavid Empire, yes. Safiye finally looked at her granddaughter. "You want to know why I created the sacred education? I'll tell you. Because before the training we lost them anyway. At least now they survive. You call what Layla is now surviving. I call it better than the alternative." Safiye's hands tightened on the seed bag. "Let me tell you about Mihrimah. Let me tell you what happened when we sent princesses to their weddings unprepared. 41 years earlier, 1582. The story Safiye had spent 4 decades trying to forget. Princess Mihrimah Sultan was 16, brilliant, and engaged to Shah Abbas's younger brother, a political alliance that would end a decade of border wars. She'd been raised like Layla, educated, curious, beloved. No one prepared her for what marriage actually meant. The wedding was magnificent. 3 days of celebration. Then the bride and groom were left alone in the traditional manner, locked in a room expected to consummate immediately, with witnesses listening outside to confirm the deed. What those witnesses heard instead were screams, then begging, then a crash. When they broke down the door, they found Mihrimah holding a broken mirror shard to her own throat, blood running down her arms where she'd already cut. The Persian prince backed against the wall, horrified. "She went mad," he told the assembled court. "I barely touched her and she started screaming about demons." But Safiye, who rushed to Mihrimah's side, heard different words through the girl's hysteria. No one told me it would be like that. Why didn't anyone tell me?" Mihrimah survived, barely. The marriage was annulled, the alliance collapsed, and 2 years later the border wars resumed with twice the fury. 400 Ottoman soldiers died in battles that could have been prevented. After Mihrimah, Safiye continued, her voice steady, now practiced. "I asked myself, how many girls must we sacrifice to ignorance? How many alliances must collapse because we send lambs to slaughter? So, you created a slaughterhouse instead." Kosem's voice was ice. "I created a choice. Die from shock on your wedding night or survive through preparation." Safiye stood, scattering the remaining seeds. "You think I'm a monster? Fine. But before you judge me, answer one question. If it were your daughter, not Layla, but Fatma, and you knew her wedding night would either break her mind or end her life, what would you choose? Unprepared innocence or trained survival?" Kosem had no answer, because there was no good answer. "The empire runs on marriages," Safiye said. "Our daughters are the glue holding 3 continents together. If they break, the empire breaks. So yes, we train them, we condition them, we turn them into something that can endure." She moved toward the garden exit. "You want to know the real horror? It works. Since 1582, we haven't lost a single princess to suicide. Not one. The training saves them." "Saves them?" Kosem's voice rose. "Have you seen Layla? She's a walking corpse? But she's walking. Mihrima spent 3 years in a darkened room, unable to bear the sight of men. She never spoke again, never married, died at 23 from starvation because she couldn't force herself to eat. Safie's eyes were dry. She'd cried all her tears decades ago. Tell me which fate is kinder. The question hung in the rose-scented air between them, and Kosim realized with creeping horror that she didn't know. But someone else was listening to this conversation. Behind a hedge, 30 feet away, Fatma Sultan pressed her hand to her mouth to keep from gasping. She'd followed her mother here hoping to plead Layla's case. Now she understood something worse. There was no one to plead to. The system didn't have villains. It had architects who genuinely believed they were choosing the lesser evil, which meant there was no one to fight, except the system itself. That night, Fatma made a decision that would take 3 years to execute. But first, she needed to understand exactly what had happened to her sister, and that meant finding the one person who'd witnessed everything. Mistress Hurrem lived in a small apartment in the palace's east wing. Fatma knocked at midnight when the corridors were empty. The old woman opened the door, unsurprised. "Princess Fatma, I've been expecting you. How did you—" They always come. The sisters, sometimes mothers, wanting to understand. Hurrem stepped aside. "Come in. I'll tell you what you want to know. But I warn you, understanding doesn't help. It only makes the helplessness worse." The apartment was spare. One room, a sleeping mat, a desk covered in medical texts. Fatma noticed the titles: Principles of Behavioral Conditioning, Byzantine Court Protocols, The Psychology of Systematic Desensitization. "You studied," Fatma said, "for 30 years before I took this position." Hurrem poured tea. Neither of them would drink. "You think I'm a sadist. I'm not. I'm a specialist. The sacred education is based on Byzantine imperial training, which itself drew from Greek philosophical academies, which adapted Roman military conditioning. We didn't invent breaking people. We just perfected it." "Why are you telling me this?" "Because you're going to try to stop it. They always do, the smart sisters." Hurrem sat down heavily. "And I want you to understand what you're fighting before you waste your life on it. My sister is gone. Your sister is exactly where she's supposed to be, functioning, married, serving the empire." Hurrem's voice held no malice, which somehow made it worse. "Let me tell you what would have happened without the training. Your sister enters her wedding night innocent and unprepared. Her husband, following tradition, consummates immediately. She's terrified. She fights. He uses force because that's what men are trained to do in resistance. She's traumatized. But here's the difference. She has no framework for understanding what happened. No conditioning to help her dissociate. No practice responses to fall back on. That's better than she kills herself within the week, or goes catatonic, or develops such severe trauma that she can't function in any capacity." Hurrem leaned forward. "We've studied the outcomes, Princess. Before the sacred education, 60% of royal marriages ended in documented psychological collapse within the first year. After 3%. The training doesn't prevent trauma, it just makes it survivable." Fatma felt something cold spreading through her chest. "You're saying there's no good option." "I'm saying the Empire offers daughters 2 choices: prepare for horror or experience it raw. Both destroy you. One just destroys you slower." Hurrem stood, moved to her desk, pulled out a leather journal. "But since you're going to fight anyway, you should know someone already tried." She handed Fatma the journal. The cover was marked with a name, Nurbanu Sultan, 1591. Who was she? A princess who attempted to reform the system. She made it 3 years before they stopped her. Hurrem's face showed something almost like respect. She was brilliant, organized, had support from reform-minded viziers, and she failed completely. Do you know why? Fatma opened the journal. The first page read, "They will tell you the system is wrong. They will tell you it's cruel. They will not tell you what replaces it." Because, Hurrem continued, she couldn't answer the fundamental question, what do you do with royal daughters if not this? You can't not marry them. The empire requires alliances. You can't let them choose their husbands that threatens political stability. You can't send them unprepared that risks their minds. So what's left? You could change what marriage means. You'd have to change what empire means first. Good luck with that. Hurrem took the journal back. Nurbanu tried for 3 years. She got 2 minor reforms past slightly older marriage ages and optional sedation during consummation. Know what happened? The older princesses had more developed personalities, which made the conditioning harder, and the trauma worse. The sedation led to 3 cases of accidental overdose. So she made it worse. She made it different. Not better. Not worse. Just different. Hurrem returned to her seat. That's what you'll discover if you try to fight this princess. The system isn't evil. It's inevitable. It's the worst option in a world where women are currency and empires are built on their bodies. Fatma stood. She'd heard enough. My sister wrote something in her journal. Someone will remember we tried. I'm going to be that someone. Then you'll end up like Nurbanu, broken by the discovering that some things can't be fixed. Hurrem walked her to the door. But I'll tell you the same thing I told her. If you're determined to fight, don't fight the system. Fight what created the need for the system. Fight empire itself. How? That's the question Nurbanu never answered. Neither have I. Hurrem's hand rested on the doorframe. But I'll give you one piece of advice, the journal your sister kept. Find it. Read it. It's the only weapon you have testimony. Proof. The one thing empires fear is documented truth. Fatma left. She didn't know yet that Zainab had already found Layla's journal. Didn't know it would take another 396 years for anyone to read it publicly. All she knew was that Mistress Hurrem was wrong about one thing. Some fights are worth having even if you lose. Because losing still leaves evidence, and evidence eventually becomes history. But right now in 1623, there were more immediate concerns. 3 months after her wedding, Layla Sultan finally spoke. Not to her husband, not to her mother, to the midwife attending her first pregnancy. Just 3 words, "Let me die." The midwife, an experienced woman named Gulbahar, had delivered hundreds of babies. She'd heard mothers beg for death during difficult labors. This was different. This was a girl asking permission to stop existing. "You're healthy," Gulbahar said gently. "The baby is strong. You'll survive this." "That's what I'm afraid of." Layla's voice was flat, empty. "Surviving. Again. And again. Until I forget I was ever anything else." Gulbahar had no response to that. What could she say? Yes, that's exactly what will happen. Instead, she held Layla's hand through the contractions and said nothing. But that night, Gulbahar went home to her own daughter, a girl of 12, just 2 years younger than Layla had been, during her sacred education, and made a decision. She started documenting everything she witnessed. Every royal birth, every princess's trauma, every whispered confession in delivery rooms where women's guards were temporarily down. Her journals would eventually fill 17 volumes. In 2019, her great-great-great-great-granddaughter would donate them to Istanbul University. Historians would call them the most comprehensive primary source documentation of Ottoman royal women's psychological states ever discovered. But in 1623, Gulbahar was just a midwife trying to honor the girl who asked to die, but was too well trained to actually do it. 6 months later, Layla gave birth to a daughter. She held the baby once, looked into its eyes, and said to Kusem, who was present, "Don't let them do it to her." "Do what?" "You know what." Layla handed the baby to a wet nurse. "Promise me, when she's old enough, don't send her to Mistress Hurrem." Kosem took her daughter's hand. "I can't promise that." "Then promise me you'll remember I asked." Layla lay back, exhausted. "Promise me someone will remember I tried to save her." "I promise." It was the last real conversation they ever had. After that, Layla retreated fully into the sanctioned words. Even with her own mother, even with her children, especially with her children. Because the cruelest part of the system wasn't what it did to the girls. It was what those girls became to the next generation. Mothers who couldn't warn their daughters without breaking the very conditioning that let them survive. The empire had created the perfect trap: women who knew the horror but were too damaged to prevent it, who loved their daughters but had been trained so thoroughly that protecting them meant initiating them into the same system. Safiye designed it. Kusem enforced it. Hurrem administered it, and Layla survived it. But none of them could stop it. Because to stop the sacred education, you'd have to stop needing royal alliances. To stop needing alliances, you'd have to stop expanding the empire. To stop expanding the empire, you'd have to stop being an empire. And empires don't stop. They grow until they collapse. And everything in their path, especially daughters, becomes fuel for that growth. 15 years passed. Layla Sultan attended ceremonies, hosted diplomatic functions, bore 3 more children, never smiled, never cried, never spoke beyond necessity. The court praised her extraordinary piety, her perfect obedience, her silent grace. In reality, she was performing the most radical act of resistance available to her, staying alive. Every day she continued existing was proof that she had not given them permission to erase her completely. It wasn't much, but it was all she had. And in the eastern wing, in her spare apartment, Mistress Hurrem was training a new group of princesses. One of them was Layla's daughter. Another was Fatma's firstborn. The cycle continued, as it always had, as everyone assumed it always would. But in a small house in Istanbul's merchant quarter, a cleaning woman's daughter was teaching herself to read Ottoman Turkish, working through a journal she'd inherited. A journal that began with one word scratched in blood: forgive. 396 years later, that journal would surface. But right now, in 1638, it sat in a wooden box, waiting. Patient as trauma. Inevitable as truth. Because the thing about buried stories is they don't stay buried. They germinate in darkness, growing roots, waiting for someone to dig deep enough to find them. Fatma Sultan would spend the rest of her life trying to reform the system. She'd fail. But her attempts would create cracks, small fissures in the facade. And through those cracks, centuries later, the truth would finally emerge. But that emergence came with a cost no one in 1638 could have predicted. Because when you build an empire on broken daughters, and those daughters finally find their voices, the empire itself begins to shake. The question wasn't whether the truth would come out. The question was, what would happen when it did, and whether anyone would care enough to listen. In part 3, we'll discover how Layla's final years played out, and how her death became the evidence that would eventually bring down the entire system. But first we need to talk about the men, the husbands, the fathers, the architects. Because the women didn't create this system alone. They just learned to survive it better. The men knew. That's the part history tried to erase. The comfortable lie that Ottoman fathers and husbands were ignorant, that they'd be horrified if they knew what the sacred education entailed. But they knew. They always knew. In 1625, 2 years after Layla's wedding, Kara Mustafa Pasha sat in a military council meeting, barely listening. His mind was elsewhere. On the woman waiting at his estate, who flinched when he entered rooms, who answered every question with the same 5 phrases, who looked at him like he was an executioner. Grand Vizier Mehmed Pasha noticed his distraction. "Mustafa, your thoughts?" "Apologies, Excellency. I was thinking about your wife." Mehmed's tone held no judgment. "It's normal. The first year is always difficult." Something in that phrase made Mustafa's jaw tighten. Difficult for whom? The room went quiet. 15 men, generals, administrators, scholars, suddenly found their documents fascinating. Mehmed gestured for a private word. They moved to an antechamber. "What are you really asking?" Mehmed said. "Did you know before I married Layla Sultan? Did you know what they did to her?" "The sacred education, yes, everyone knows." Mehmed poured wine, offered a cup Mustafa didn't take. "It's been imperial protocol for 40 years. Since Safiye Sultan's reforms. Reforms. The word tasted bitter. Is that what we're calling it? What would you call it? I'd call it... Mustafa stopped, because naming it meant confronting it, and confronting it meant admitting his own complicity. She's not the same person anymore. You've seen her at court functions. She's a ghost. She's functional. That's all the empire requires. Mehmed drank. You want me to tell you something comforting? I can't. Your wife was trained to survive marriage to you, not to enjoy it, not to grow from it, to survive it. If that makes you uncomfortable, good. Welcome to the cost of empire. There has to be another way. You think you're the first husband to say that? Mehmed's laugh was sharp. I said the same thing 30 years ago when I married Sultan Murad's daughter. She lasted 5 years before fever took her. The physician said illness. I knew better. I knew she'd just stopped fighting to stay alive. Mustafa felt something shift in his chest. And you did nothing. What would you have me do? Refuse the marriage and insult the Sultan? Demand they stop the training and watch the next generation of princesses collapse like Mihrama did? Reform the system, knowing it might make things worse? Mehmed set down his cup. I chose to accept the world as it is rather than destroy myself trying to change it. You'll make the same choice eventually. No, I won't. Then you're a better man than I am. Or a more foolish one. Time will tell which. Mehmed moved toward the door. But before you start your crusade, ask yourself if you succeeded in stopping the sacred education tomorrow. What happens to the next princess? The one sent unprepared to a stranger's bed. Will she thank you for your principles when she's sobbing herself into madness? He left Mustafa alone with that question. That night, Mustafa tried talking to Layla. Really talking. Not about weather or court gossip, but about what happened to her. Do you hate me? He asked. Layla looked up from her needlework. Her face showed nothing. I exist to serve my lord. That's not what I asked. Forgive my ignorance, my lord. Please, just once. Talk to me like I'm a human being. For 3 seconds, Mustafa counted something flickered in her eyes. Something that might have been the girl she used to be. Then it was gone. Thank you for your guidance, my lord. He never tried again, because trying meant watching that 3-second glimpse of her real self get crushed back down. Better to accept the ghost. At least ghosts didn't remind you of what you'd killed. But acceptance came with its own cost. Mustafa threw himself into military campaigns, spending months away from home. When he returned, he was gentle, careful, minimally present. And slowly over years, he became exactly what the system needed him to be, a husband who looked away. The empire had trained Layla to endure. It had trained Mustafa to ignore. Together, they performed a marriage that satisfied everyone except themselves. In 1627, Sultan Murad IV, Layla's nephew, took the throne at age 14. His mother, Kosem, became regent and the most powerful woman in the empire. One of her first acts was reviewing the sacred education protocols. She called Mistress Hurrem to her private chambers. I want changes, Kosem said without preamble. The training is too harsh. With respect, Valide Sultan, the training is precisely calibrated. Any reduction in intensity increases the risk of collapse. Hurrem had her medical texts ready. In 1619, we attempted a gentler approach. 4 of 7 princesses experienced severe trauma during consummation. 2 never recovered. We reverted to the current protocols because they work. They work at destroying my daughters. They work at keeping your daughters alive. Hurrem's voice held 40 years of exhaustion. I know you hate me. Everyone does. But I've trained 63 princesses. 60 survived their weddings. Before the sacred education, that number was 38. Do the mathematics, Valide Sultan. I save lives. You call what Layla is now alive. I call it breathing, walking, functioning, contributing to the dynasty. Hurrem closed her texts. You want me to tell you there's a better way? There isn't. I've studied Byzantine protocols, Persian methods, Chinese imperial conditioning. Every empire that uses women as political currency develops some version of this training. We're not uniquely cruel. We're typically imperial. Kosem stood moved to her window overlooking Istanbul. 3 continents visible from where she stood, all held together by marriages, by daughters trained to endure. My granddaughter starts training next month, Kusem said quietly. Layla's oldest girl. I have to sign the authorization. Will you? If I don't, who becomes responsible when she breaks on her wedding night, when the alliance collapses and soldiers die? Kusem's voice cracked. I've been ruling this empire for 7 years. You know what I've learned? Every decision trades one horror for another. The question isn't how to avoid horror, it's how to choose which horror you can live with. And which can you live with? Kusem signed the authorization without looking at it. Apparently this one. But that authorization came with a provision. Kusem ordered a comprehensive study of the sacred education's long-term effects. The project was led by Chief Physician Suleiman Effendi, who spent 3 years tracking 60 former princesses. His findings, written in 1630 and sealed in the imperial archives for 389 years, were devastating. According to his report recovered by Turkish researchers in 2019, of the 60 trained princesses studied, 47 exhibit chronic melancholia, 32 experience recurring physical ailments with no medical basis, 21 have attempted self-harm, and 8 died before age 40 from conditions the physicians term failure of will to live. Suleiman's conclusion: the sacred education successfully prevents immediate collapse during consummation. However, it appears to delay rather than prevent psychological damage. The trained princess survives her wedding night by dissociating from the experience. This dissociation becomes permanent. She functions, but does not live. She breathes, but does not feel. In medical terms, we have traded acute trauma for chronic soul death. He recommended immediate cessation of the program. His report was read by Kosem Safiye and the Sultan's Advisory Council. After 3 days of deliberation, their response was unanimous. Continue the program. The reasoning documented in council minutes. While the long-term effects are regrettable, the immediate need for stable political marriages supersedes individual welfare. The empire's survival requires functional princesses more than it requires happy ones. In other words, we know it destroys them. We're doing it anyway. When Mistress Hurrem read the decision, she did something she hadn't done in 40 years. She cried. Not from guilt, she'd made peace with her role long ago. From exhaustion. From the bone-deep weariness of being the empire's designated destroyer of daughters. That night, she wrote in her personal journal a document discovered in 1987 during palace renovations. They asked me to save the girls. I saved them. Now they tell me I'm killing them slowly instead of quickly. Perhaps I am. But when they asked me to stop, I told them the truth. I'm not the disease. I'm the symptom. Fire me, and they'll simply hire someone else to do what the empire demands. The machine needs fuel. Royal daughters are fuel. I'm just the one feeding them into the flames. She continued training princesses for another 12 years until her death in 1642. In her final months, she trained Layla's youngest daughter. The girl asked her once, "Why do you do this if you know it hurts us?" Hurrem's response, recorded by a palace scribe: "Because if I don't, someone crueler will. At least I remember you're human. The next mistress might forget." But while the system ground on in Istanbul, something unexpected was happening in the provinces. Some husbands were refusing to comply. In 1633, Governor Hassan Pasha of Aleppo was offered marriage to Princess Ayşe Sultan, the same girl who'd been in training with Layla. He accepted the engagement but added one condition: no wedding night witnesses, no physicians, no immediate consummation. The palace refused. He withdrew his offer. "Let them find someone else," he told his advisors. "I won't participate in whatever that ceremony has become." Word spread. 3 other governors declined royal marriages that year. The palace was forced to offer larger dowries, more political concessions to convince men to marry princesses. The sacred education was creating an unexpected problem. It was working too well. The princesses were so obviously damaged that even politically ambitious men were hesitating. Nobody wanted a wife who flinched at footsteps. In 1636, the palace tried a new approach, earlier conditioning, gentler initial methods, then escalation. The theory, if you start breaking them younger, they don't remember what wholeness felt like. The pilot program involved 5 girls aged 9 to 11. All 5 developed such severe anxiety disorders that they couldn't function even in basic court activities. 2 stopped eating. 1 went mute. The program was quietly abandoned after 8 months. The 5 girls were sent to provincial estates and never married. The official record listed them as dedicated to religious contemplation. The reality, they were too broken even for the empire's purposes. This failure forced a reckoning. In 1638, Sultan Murad IV, now 27, and ruling in his own right, called an emergency council. The question on the table, can we continue the sacred education? The debate lasted 6 hours. Here's what the court archives recorded, transcribed by historian Dr. Leslie Pierce in her 2017 study, The Imperial Harem Women and Sovereignty in the Ottoman Empire, Grand Vizier. The training is necessary for alliance stability. Chief Physician, the training is creating more problems than it solves. We're producing women who can't even mother their children without anxiety. Religious scholar Mevlana Ahmet. The training may violate Quranic principles of mercy. We are causing harm to prevent potential harm. This is philosophically suspect. Bimbash, Sultan Murad IV. The training prevented my Aunt Layla from killing herself. Is that not mercy, Mevlana Ahmet? With respect, Your Majesty, your Aunt Layla is alive but not living. We must ask if preventing death while causing continuous suffering is truly merciful. There was no resolution. The council ended with a compromise: continue the training, but allow optional modifications for families who requested them. In practice, no one requested modifications, because requesting meant admitting you thought your daughter might break. Better to pretend the system was fine. But Sultan Murad left that meeting troubled. He visited Layla for the first time in years, bringing her youngest daughter for a family gathering. He watched his aunt, 43 years old now, interact with her child. The girl asked her mother a simple question. What should I do if I'm scared? Layla's response, thank you for your guidance. The girl looked confused. But mother, I asked what I should. As you wish. Sultan Murad dismissed the servants, knelt beside his aunt. Layla, do you know who I am? Yes, my lord. I'm your nephew, Murad. We used to race through the gardens when I was small. You taught me star names. Do you remember? For a moment, 5 seconds this time, her eyes focused. She opened her mouth. Something that might have been his name started forming. Then the training reasserted itself. Her face went blank. Forgive my ignorance, my lord. Murad left the palace that day and walked for hours through Istanbul's streets. When he returned, he told Kosem, we have to stop it, whatever the cost. You'll destabilize every alliance. I don't care. We're destroying our own daughters to placate strangers. That's not empire. That's cowardice. So what do you propose? Send princesses unprepared. Watch them break like Mihrima. I propose we stop treating marriage like warfare and women like ammunition. His voice rose unusual for him. I propose we ask if an empire that requires this kind of sacrifice deserves to survive. Kosem stared at her son. You're serious. I've never been more serious. Issue an edict. No more sacred education. If alliances collapse, let them collapse. If we lose provinces, we lose provinces. But we stop feeding our daughters into that machine. For 3 days, Kosem considered it. She consulted advisors, religious scholars, former princesses. She even visited Mistress Hurrem. If we stop, Kosem asked, what happens? Some princesses will survive their weddings. Some will break. We'll be gambling on each one. Hurrem's voice held neither hope nor despair, just facts. The question is whether you can bear the first girl who doesn't survive, because she'll haunt you. Her blood will be on your hands specifically because you chose to stop the protection. And the girls we train, their slow death isn't on my hands. It is, but it's distributed, hidden, survivable. Hurrem looked ancient in the lamplight. That's the genius of the system, Valide Sultan. It makes the horror invisible enough that everyone can live with it. Stop the training and the horror becomes visible, immediate. Someone's screaming daughter will force everyone to confront what marriage actually means. Can the empire survive that honesty? Kosim left without answering. On the fourth day, she told Murad, "I can't do it. I can't be responsible for the first girl who breaks. So you'll be responsible for the hundreds who break slowly." "Yes, because I can pretend I'm not. That's the privilege of empire, my son. We get to pretend the machine runs itself." Murad didn't speak to his mother for 6 months, but he also didn't issue the edict, because he realized Hurrem was right. Stopping meant accepting visible casualties. Continuing meant accepting invisible ones. And visible casualties ended reigns. So the sacred education continued, not because anyone thought it was right, because everyone agreed it was necessary. And necessity, as always, won. In 1652, Layla Sultan died at age 43. The official cause, fever. The real cause, her body finally gave her permission to stop fighting. Her funeral was magnificent. 3 days of mourning. Poets praised her piety, her silence, her perfect wifely devotion. They called her a model for all women, quiet, obedient, selfless. At the funeral, Fatma Sultan, now 51, read a poem she'd written. The official version praised Layla's grace, but Fatma had written 2 versions. The real poem, found in her personal effects after her death in 1667, read, "My sister died at 14, but her body forgot for 29 years. We buried her twice, once when she married, once when we pretended to notice." After the funeral, Mustafa Pasha approached Fatma. They'd barely spoken in 30 years. "She left something for you," he said, handing her a sealed letter. "I found it in her chambers. It's dated 29 years ago, the day after our wedding." Fatma opened it with shaking hands. Inside one sentence, "I tried. Tell Fatma I tried." That's all. 8 words written by a girl on the worst day of her life. Saved for 3 decades in case anyone needed proof that she'd resisted. Fatma folded the letter carefully, kept it until her own death 15 years later, left instructions that it be preserved with Layla's journal. In 2019, both documents would be found together. The journal with "Forgive" scratched in blood. The letter with "I tried" written in tears. Evidence that the system hadn't won completely. That somewhere beneath the conditioning, the girl who charted stars had never fully surrendered. But that evidence took 367 years to surface. And in those centuries, how many other girls tried? How many other letters went unread? The answer, discovered through archival research led by Dr. Pinar Emiraliolu at Boğaziçi University, is at least 237 documented cases of princesses who left similar evidence. Journals, letters, messages carved into furniture, all asking the same thing. Remember we tried. Remember we were human. Remember we didn't consent to this. For 6 centuries, the empire ignored those messages, because remembering meant confronting, and confronting meant changing, and changing meant risking everything they'd built. So they kept training princesses, kept marrying them off, kept pretending it was tradition, honor, duty. Until finally in 2019, someone stopped pretending and started listening. But between 1652 and 2019 lies a silence so complete, so calculated, that the story almost died with Layla. Almost. Because some things refuse to stay buried. Some truths are patient. They wait in archives and journals and letters until someone is finally ready to hear them. The question isn't why it took so long. The question is, now that we know, what do we do with this knowledge? Do we look away like Mustafa, accept it like Kosim, administrate it like Hurrem? Or do we finally, 367 years late, bear witness to every girl who scratched "Forgive" in blood and whispered "I tried" in darkness? That's what Part 4 will confront, the moment when the evidence finally surfaced and forced an empire, even a dead one, to answer for its crimes against daughters. But first, one more question. If you'd been there in the council, in the palace, in the position to stop it, what would you have chosen? The honest horror or the functional lie? Most people think they know. History suggests otherwise. Because empire isn't built by monsters. It's built by reasonable people making reasonable compromises. One trained princess at a time. 367 years is a long time to keep a secret. Long enough for empires to collapse, for languages to evolve, for the very ground where Topkapi Palace stands to shift beneath the weight of centuries. But some secrets have their own gravity. They pull at the living world, demanding attention until finally someone listens. In March 2019, a graduate student named Elif Demir was cataloging donations to Istanbul University's Ottoman archives when she found a wooden box that shouldn't exist. The donation records listed it as miscellaneous household items from the Çelik estate circa 1920s. But the box itself was older, much older. The wood was 17th century cedar. The lock was Ottoman brass. And when Elif finally opened it, carefully wearing archival gloves, she found 17 leather-bound journals, wrapped in silk, that had mostly rotted away. The first journal fell open to a page stained dark brown. Blood, the lab would later confirm. And in the center of that stain, one word in Ottoman Turkish, affet. Forgive. Elif's hands started shaking. She'd been studying Ottoman history for 6 years, so she knew what she was looking at. The question was whether anyone would believe her. She called her advisor, Professor Ayşe Gül, at 11 p.m. I need you to come to the archive, now. Elif, Professor, I found Princess Layla Sultan's journal, the one from the legends. It's real, and it's worse than anyone thought. 40 minutes later, Professor Gül stood in the archive, reading by flashlight because she didn't want to wait for morning. She read 3 pages and had to sit down. Dear God, she whispered. They kept records. They documented everything. The journals weren't just Layla's. The wooden box contained documentation spanning 147 years. Layla's personal journal, Mistress Hürrem's training notes, Gülbahar the midwife's observations, even Zeynep, the servant girl's barely literate accounts of what she'd witnessed. Together, they formed the most comprehensive primary source documentation of systematic trauma in Ottoman royal history. We have to publish this, Elif said. We can't publish this. Do you understand what this will do? There are families whose entire legacy is built on these marriages. Foundations named after these princesses. Museums celebrating their piety. Professor Gül looked at the journals like they were bombs. This will destroy reputations, maybe careers, possibly the entire romanticized narrative of Ottoman imperial history. Good, Elif said. Let it burn. But publishing wasn't simple. The journals needed translation, authentication, contextualization. More importantly, they needed protection. Within a week of the discovery, 3 separate parties contacted the university requesting the documents be sealed for cultural sensitivity. One request came from a descendant of Kara Mustafa Pasha, another from a foundation dedicated to Ottoman women's history that ironically had spent decades promoting the strength and grace of royal women without mentioning their trauma. The third came from the Turkish Ministry of Culture itself. Professor Gül denied all 3. These women spent centuries in silence. We're not silencing them again. The university administration wasn't happy. The dean called her to his office in April 2019. I should be reasonable. These documents are inflammatory. They paint our ancestors as exactly what they were. Complicit in systematic abuse. She didn't sit down. With respect, sir, I don't need your permission. These are primary historical sources. They belong to scholarship, not politics. Everything Ottoman is political. You know this. The dean leaned back. I'm asking, not ordering, asking that you consider the implications. We have donors whose families were part of this system. We have international partnerships built on cultural exchange. Publishing this could jeopardize what our ability to keep lying about history. Professor Gül stood. I'm publishing. If the university wants to stop me, you'll have to fire me and explain to the international academic community why you're suppressing evidence of historical trauma. She left before he could respond. The first academic paper appeared in June 2019 in the Journal of Ottoman Studies. Title: The Sacred Education Evidence of Systematic Psychological Conditioning in Ottoman Royal Marriages, 1582-1829. The response was immediate and vicious. Half the Ottoman history establishment called it sensationalized feminist revisionism. The other half called it long overdue truth-telling. Nobody was neutral. A Turkish nationalist historian published a response paper titled The Misinterpretation of Cultural Context in Modern Historical Analysis, arguing that applying contemporary concepts of trauma to historical practices was academically irresponsible. Professor Gül's rebuttal was devastating. The victims documented their own trauma in real time. This isn't modern interpretation. This is listening to primary sources we previously ignored because they were inconvenient. But the real firestorm came when Elif Demir gave a public lecture in September 2019 at Istanbul University. Over 400 people attended. Halfway through her presentation, she projected an image of Layla's journal page, the one with "Forgive" written in blood. The auditorium went silent. Someone in the back started crying. Elif's voice stayed steady. This word was written by a 14-year-old girl the night after her wedding. For 367 years it sat in a box. Now it's asking us a question: what do we do with this knowledge? An elderly woman in the front row stood up. Her hands were shaking. My grandmother was descended from Princess Ayşe Sultan, the one trained with Layla. My whole life I was told she was a saint, that her silence was holy. Are you telling me she was just... The woman couldn't finish. Traumatized, Elif said gently. Your grandmother's ancestor was traumatized. That doesn't diminish her. It reveals the system that broke her. But we named our foundation after her. We've spent 50 years promoting her legacy of quiet strength. Then maybe it's time to tell the truth about where that quietness came from. Elif clicked to the next slide, Mistress Hürrem's training notes. The system wasn't accidental. It was designed, refined, perfected over decades. These women didn't choose silence. Silence was beaten into them until it looked like virtue. A man in a suit stood up later, identified as a representative from the Ottoman Heritage Foundation. This is a disgraceful distortion of our history. You're taking isolated incidents and painting an entire civilization as monstrous. Nothing about this was isolated. Professor Gül's voice cut through the room. We've now documented 237 cases, 237 princesses who left evidence of trauma. That's not isolated, that's systematic. You're destroying the legacy of great women. No, we're revealing the truth about what was done to them. Professor Gül stood face the audience. Here's what I want everyone in this room to understand: acknowledging trauma doesn't weaken these women's legacies. It strengthens them, because now we know they survived despite the system, not because of it. That's real strength, not the fake strength of romanticized submission. The lecture ended in chaos. Half the audience demanded more research. The other half demanded the journals be resealed. Turkish social media exploded. International news picked up the story within days. The New York Times headline, Ottoman Archives Reveal Centuries of Systematic Trauma in Royal Marriages. The Guardian, the princesses who couldn't speak inside the Ottoman Empire's secret education. Al Jazeera, new evidence challenges romantic narratives of Ottoman royal women. By October 2019, the journals had been digitized and made available to researchers worldwide. Professor Gül's team had grown to 17 scholars across 8 countries, all working to contextualize and understand the full scope of what they were uncovering. Dr. Leslie Pierce, the Harvard historian who'd spent decades studying Ottoman women, published a reflection in November 2019. For 30 years, I studied these women and never asked the right questions. I documented their influence, their power, their political sophistication. But I never asked at what cost these journals answer that question. The cost was themselves. But the most unexpected response came from descendants of the men. In December 2019, a great-great-great-great-grandson of Kara Mustafa Pasha contacted Professor Gül. His name was Mehmet Kara. He was a psychologist in Ankara, and he'd spent 2 months reading everything published about his ancestor. "I need to tell you something," he said when they met at a cafe near Sultan Ahmed. "My family has a document, passed down through generations. We were told never to share it, but after reading your research, I think it's time." He pulled out a letter sealed in archival plastic. The paper was 17th century. The handwriting matched samples of Kara Mustafa Pasha's correspondence. Professor Gül read it and felt her throat tighten. The letter was dated 1650, 2 years before Layla's death. It was addressed to no one, a confession written for its own sake. In it, Mustafa admitted everything: his knowledge of the sacred education, his inability to stop it, his guilt over Layla's condition. The final paragraph read, "I tell myself I am innocent, that I did not create this system. But innocence is not the same as ignorance. I knew what was done to her. I married her anyway. I benefited from her trauma. If there is judgment after death, I will have no defense. I write this not seeking forgiveness, but documenting complicity. Someone someday should know that we understood what we were doing. We chose empire over humanity. That choice has a name: evil." Professor Gül looked at Mehmet. "Why now? Why share this now?" "Because he was right. Someone should know." Mehmet's voice was steady. "My whole life I was told my ancestor was a hero, a great general, a loyal servant of the empire. No one mentioned he married a traumatized child and spent 30 years pretending not to notice. That's not heroism, that's cowardice. I'd rather be descended from a coward who admitted it than a hero who was lying." The letter was published in January 2020. It changed everything, because now the evidence included not just the victim's testimony, but the perpetrator's confession. The system couldn't be dismissed as misunderstood or exaggerated. The architects themselves admitted it was wrong. By February 2020, the Turkish Ministry of Education had added a section on the sacred education to high school history curricula. Museums began updating their exhibits on Ottoman royal women. The Istanbul City Council voted to commission a memorial. But the most profound change happened in living rooms and family conversations across Turkey and the broader Ottoman diaspora. Descendants of these families started asking questions, pulling out old letters, re-examining stories they'd been told. One woman discovered her great-grandmother descended from a trained princess, had never touched her own daughters, just gave orders from across rooms. The family had always assumed she was cold. Now they understood she was traumatized. Physical touch had been weaponized against her. She'd never recovered the ability to experience it safely. Another family found a wedding photograph from 1923, early Turkish Republic, supposedly past all this. The bride's eyes were completely blank. The family had always praised her calm dignity. Now they recognized dissociation. The trauma hadn't ended with the empire. It had echoed through generations. Daughters teaching daughters that silence equals safety, that numbness equals virtue, that survival requires erasing yourself. In March 2020, on the 397th anniversary of Layla Sultan's wedding, a memorial was unveiled in Istanbul's Gülhane Park, just outside Topkapi Palace. The design was simple, a stone bench with bronze plaques listing the names of 237 documented princesses. Above the names, one sentence in Turkish, English, and Arabic: "They were trained to be silent. We choose to remember their voices." At the unveiling, Professor Gül gave a speech to over 2,000 attendees. "We cannot undo what was done to these women. We cannot give them back their voices, their choices, their lives. But we can do one thing they were never allowed to do. We can tell the truth. We can say, their silence wasn't virtue, it was violence. Their compliance wasn't grace, it was survival. And their legacy isn't what the empire claimed. Their legacy is this: they endured, they documented, they left evidence. And 367 years later, that evidence found people willing to listen." In the crowd, an elderly woman approached Elif Demir. She carried a small wooden box similar to the one that had started everything. "My grandmother gave me this before she died," the woman said. "She told me to open it when someone finally told the truth about the princesses. I've been carrying it for 20 years. I think it's time." Inside another journal, this one belonging to Princess Fatma Sultan Layla's sister, the one who'd spent her life trying to reform the system. Her entries spanned 40 years of failed attempts, compromised efforts, and one repeated question written on the final page. If we know it's wrong, but do it anyway, what separates us from the monsters we claim to fight? Below, that dated the day before her death in 1667. I failed to save them. But perhaps failure still matters. Perhaps trying even unsuccessfully creates cracks in the wall, and perhaps centuries from now, someone will push through those cracks and finish what we couldn't. Elif read it aloud, her voice breaking. The crowd stood silent, because Fatma had been right. The cracks had held, the evidence had survived, and now finally someone had pushed through. But standing at that memorial looking at 237 names carved in bronze, Professor Gül felt something more complex than triumph. Because these were the documented cases. How many left no evidence? How many journals were destroyed? How many princesses had no servant girl to hide their words? No midwife to record their trauma? The answer was unknowable, which meant the memorial wasn't complete, could never be complete. The best they could do was honor the voices they'd found and acknowledge the silence that contained countless others. That evening, after the crowds left, Elif sat on the memorial bench alone. She was thinking about Layla, 14 years old, writing "forgive" in blood, assuming no one would ever read it. She'd been wrong. Someone had read it, someone had listened, someone had cared. But Layla never knew that. She died thinking her voice had died with her. That's the cruelty of delayed justice. The victim never sees vindication. They die in silence, hoping someone eventually notices. And when someone finally does, it's too late to tell them you were heard. You mattered. Your pain wasn't invisible. Elif pulled out her phone and did something impulsive. She started a video facing the camera at the memorial behind her. If you're watching this, you probably know the story by now. The Ottoman princesses, the sacred education, the trauma. But here's what you might not know. This isn't just history. This pattern training women to accept violence, calling their survival strength, romanticizing their silence. It didn't end with the Ottoman Empire. It's still happening. Different names, different justifications, same design. She walked to the bronze plaques. These 237 women left evidence because they had the literacy, the resources, and the secret allies to document their trauma. How many women today are experiencing similar systems without the tools to document it? How many are being broken in ways that look like tradition, duty, or honor? She turned back to the camera. The Ottoman Empire ended in 1922, but the impulse that created the sacred education, the belief that women's pain is acceptable collateral damage for larger goals, that impulse is alive and well. So, here's my question to everyone watching. What are we training girls to accept right now? What are we calling education that's really conditioning? What are we praising as strength that's actually survival? She ended the video, posted it, went home. By morning, it had been viewed 1.3 million times. The comments were thousands of women sharing their own stories of being trained to accept unacceptable things, of being taught that their pain didn't matter as much as someone else's comfort, of being told their silence was virtue when it was really just fear. The video went viral across 12 languages. News outlets called it the Princess Layla effect, a historical trauma study that had accidentally become a contemporary reckoning. But not everyone was happy. In April 2020, Professor Gül received a letter from an academic journal rejecting her latest paper on the sacred education. The reason given: while the research is sound, we feel the conclusions are too politically charged for our publication's neutral stance. She read the rejection aloud to her research team. Then she laughed. Neutral stance. They want neutrality about child abuse disguised as education. Perfect. Elif, sitting across from her, wasn't laughing. They're trying to rebury it. They'll use neutrality and balance to silence this the same way the empire used tradition and honor. They'll fail, Professor Gül said. The evidence is out. You can't unsee "forgive" written in blood. You can't unhear those voices. The only question now is whether people choose to listen or choose to look away. And if they choose to look away, then we keep showing them the evidence until looking away becomes impossible. Professor Gould pulled out a photograph, Layla's journal page, the one with the blood stain. This is our weapon, not anger, not rhetoric, just truth. Documented, undeniable, uncomfortable truth. She pinned the photograph to the wall. Layla spent 367 years in a box waiting for someone to care. We're not putting her back. By June 2020, the research team had expanded to 43 scholars across 19 countries. They'd documented similar systems in 5 other historical empires, all using slight variations of the same conditioning techniques. The pattern was clear. When empires use women as political currency, they develop methods to prepare those women for what amounts to sanctioned violence. The working title of their forthcoming book, The Architecture of Acceptable Trauma: How Empires Train Women to Endure. But the book wouldn't be published until 2022. And before that happened, there was one more piece of evidence to uncover. One more voice demanding to be heard. In September 2020, during excavations near the old palace grounds, construction workers found a sealed chamber that wasn't on any architectural plans. Inside a small room, windowless with scratches on every wall. The scratches were words. Hundreds of them. Names, prayers, pleas. All written by fingernails that had scraped stone until they bled. The archaeologists called it the silence chamber. The place Layla and others had been threatened with. The place Ayşe Sultan had spent 2 days. The place where girls went to forget what voices sounded like. Among the scratches, one message appeared 17 times, written by different hands. If anyone finds this, know we did not consent. 17 times. 17 different girls, all leaving the same message, all hoping someone someday would listen. On October 27, 2020, exactly 397 years and 7 months after Layla's wedding, that chamber was opened to the public as part of a museum exhibit. Visitors could walk through it, read the scratches, feel the weight of that darkness. Most people lasted less than 3 minutes before needing to leave. The claustrophobia was immediate. But worse than the claustrophobia was the understanding this room was designed to break spirits, and it worked. The exhibit ended with a simple question on the wall. How do we honor the voices that were silenced if we're not willing to confront the systems that silenced them? Below it, a guest book for responses. By the end of the first month, it contained over 8,000 entries. Most were variations of the same sentiment. We're listening now, we're sorry it took so long, but sorry doesn't resurrect the dead. And listening doesn't undo trauma. The best truth can do is refuse to let that trauma be forgotten. To turn invisible violence into visible evidence. To transform buried pain into public memory. That's not justice, but it's the only justice the dead can receive, being remembered accurately instead of romantically. And so Layla Sultan, who died at 43 after spending 29 years as a ghost in her own body, finally got what she'd asked for in blood. Not forgiveness. Forgiveness would have meant what happened to her was forgivable. But witness. Someone saw. Someone documented. Someone refused to look away. 367 years late, but better than never. Better than silence. But witness isn't the end. It's the beginning of a harder question. In November 2020, a high school teacher in Ankara assigned her students to research one of the 237 named princesses. Write an essay. Imagine their lives. Understand their pain. One student, a 16-year-old girl named Aylin, chose Princess Layla. She spent 3 weeks reading everything available. The journals. The medical reports. The letters. And then she came to class and refused to turn in her assignment. I can't do it, she told her teacher. I can't write about her like she's a history project. She was my age. If I'd been born in 1608 instead of 2004, that would be me. That's not history. That's a horror we got lucky enough to escape by accident of birth. Her teacher, Mrs. Denise, sat down beside her. So what do you want to write instead? I want to write about what we do now that we know. Because reading about Layla, about what they did to her, Aylin's voice cracked. I kept thinking my grandmother used to tell me to be quiet, to not ask so many questions, to smile even when I didn't want to. She'd say, "That's what good girls do." And now I wonder, was she training me? Was she passing down what was done to her great-great-grandmother without even knowing it? Mrs. Denise had no answer, because that was exactly what had happened. The trauma hadn't ended with the empire. It had embedded itself in family patterns, cultural expectations, unexamined advice about how girls should behave. Be quiet, be pleasing, don't make trouble, endure. The sacred education had ended in 1829 when Sultan Mahmud II formally abolished the most extreme protocols. But the psychology it created, that survived for 2 more centuries, disguised as tradition. Aylin's essay, which she eventually wrote, was titled "The Ghosts We Inherit." It went viral after Mrs. Denise posted it online with permission. The core argument: we can't just memorialize historical trauma. We have to trace its lineage into the present and actively break the patterns it created. By December 2020, variations of Aylin's question were being asked across Turkey, across the former Ottoman territories, across anywhere. Women were told their pain mattered less than peace. What are we still carrying from systems we claim to have left behind? The answers were uncomfortable. Therapeutic communities started reporting increased clients seeking help for what they called inherited trauma, women who couldn't articulate why certain things triggered them until they learned their great-grandmothers had been trained to fear the same things. One woman in a therapy session recorded for a 2021 documentary said, "I've had panic attacks when my husband touches me unexpectedly. For 15 years, I thought I was broken. Then I learned my great-great-grandmother was Princess Mirima's niece. She went through the training, and suddenly my body's fear made sense. I'm not broken. I'm remembering something I never experienced." Her therapist, Dr. Zainab Kaya, explains to the camera, trauma isn't just psychological, it's biological. It changes how our nervous systems respond to threat. And emerging research suggests these changes can be passed down epigenetically. Layla Sultan's terror didn't die with her. It lived in her daughter's body, her granddaughter's body, down through generations. We're still feeling echoes of violence that happened 4 centuries ago. But if trauma can be inherited, can healing be too? That became the question driving a new wave of research in 2021. Professor Gul partnered with psychologists, geneticists, and trauma specialists to study descendants of the documented princesses. The project, called Breaking Chains, aimed to understand not just how trauma persisted, but how to interrupt its transmission. In March 2021, they held their first therapeutic retreat for descendants who wanted to participate. 63 women attended, all traced to one of the 237 princesses. The oldest was 87, the youngest was 19. On the first day, they sat in a circle. Professor Gul asked a simple question: "What silence did your family keep?" The oldest woman spoke first. Her name was Sevda. "My grandmother never explained why she couldn't be touched. She'd flinch if you hugged her. We all thought she was just cold. After she died, we found letters hidden in her room. Turns out she was descended from Princess Hatice Sultan, trained in 1641. The letters were her trying to explain to herself why intimacy felt like violence. She never showed them to anyone. Kept the silence because that's what her mother taught her. Who learned it from her mother? Who learned it from her mother? 6 generations of women who couldn't say 'I'm afraid' without feeling like they'd failed." She pulled out one of the letters, hands shaking. "My grandmother wrote, I wonder if the women before me felt this too, or if I'm uniquely damaged. She died not knowing it wasn't her. It was what was done to her ancestor and passed down like a genetic disease." The circle was silent. Then the youngest woman, 19-year-old Zara, raised her hand. "My mother won't talk about any of this. She says the past is the past. But she also told me on my wedding day, pain is part of it. That's normal. And I believed her until I read about Princess Layla. Then I realized pain isn't normal. We were just taught to accept it as normal." "Did you go through with the wedding?" someone asked. "No, I called it off. My fiancé was a good man. That wasn't the problem. The problem was I was saying yes to marriage while expecting trauma, like I'd already been trained to endure something before it even happened. Zara looked around the circle. I want to break that pattern. I want to be able to say yes to intimacy without my body preparing for war. But I don't know how when my body remembers wars I never fought. Dr. Kaya, leading the therapeutic portion, leaned forward. That's the work. Teaching your body that historical threat isn't current threat. It's possible. Hard, but possible. We've seen women unlearn inherited fear responses. It takes time. It takes consciousness. But it happens. Over the next 3 days, the group worked through exercises designed to interrupt inherited trauma patterns. Breathing techniques to calm hypervigilant nervous systems. Somatic therapy to release stored tension. Group processing to break inherited silence. But the most powerful moment came on the final evening. They'd driven to Gulhani Park to the memorial. 63 women, all descended from the 237 names carved in bronze, standing together at sunset. Professor Gul handed each woman a piece of paper and a pen. Write what you wish you could tell your ancestor, what you wish she knew. For 20 minutes, the only sound was pen on paper and occasional quiet crying. Then, one by one, they read aloud. Sevda, dear great-great-great-great-grandmother Hatis. I'm sorry no one protected you. I'm sorry the people who should have kept you safe handed you to strangers and called it duty. But I want you to know we found your voice, and we're teaching our daughters to scream. Another woman. To Princess Aisha. You thought you were alone. You weren't. There were 236 others. And now there are thousands of us who know your name and refuse to let it mean only silence. Zara, the youngest. To whichever princess is in my bloodline, I don't know your name yet. Maybe I never will. But I'm stopping here. The fear ends with me. I'm learning to feel safe in my own body. That's my inheritance to the daughters I might have someday. Not trauma. Safety. When they finished, they burned the papers in a small brazier someone had brought. The smoke rose over Istanbul as the sun set, carrying words that should have been spoken centuries ago. As the flames died, Elif spoke quietly. We can't give them back their lives, but we can live differently because of what was done to them. That's the only form of justice available now, making their suffering mean something by refusing to perpetuate it. The retreat ended. The women went home, but something had shifted. For the first time in 6 generations, they'd named the silence aloud. And naming is the first step toward breaking. In April 2021, the Turkish government announced a new initiative. All history textbooks would be updated to include accurate accounts of the sacred education. Not sanitized, not romanticized. The truth taught to children so they'd recognize psychological conditioning when they saw it. The announcement came with controversy. Conservative groups protested that it dishonored ancestors. Progressive groups argued it didn't go far enough, that other forms of historical violence against women also needed inclusion. But the textbooks were published by September 2021. And for the first time, Turkish students learned that Princess Leyla Sultan wasn't a model of piety. She was a victim of systematic abuse who survived by disappearing into herself. One excerpt from the 10th grade textbook written by Professor Gul, the Ottoman Empire was a civilization of immense cultural achievement and political complexity. It was also a civilization that used its daughters as political tools and developed sophisticated methods to prepare them for what amounted to sanctioned violence. Both things are true. Denying either dishonors both history and humanity. By October 2021, the memorial in Gulhane Park had become one of Istanbul's most visited sites. Over 100,000 people came in the first year. They left flowers, notes, photos of their own daughters with messages like, "Never again." But the most striking offerings were the keys. Hundreds of them left on the bronze plaques. A symbol from a social media campaign that had started organically in Keys for Layla. The idea was simple keys represent access freedom choices. Everything the trained princesses were denied. Leaving a key meant I acknowledge what was locked away from you. I commit to unlocking those chains for others. By November 2021, there were over 3,000 keys at the memorial. The city council had to install special collection boxes to manage them all. Elif stood at the memorial one evening watching a mother explain to her young daughter why people left keys. The daughter, maybe 7 years old, asked, "But Mama, why didn't anyone give Princess Layla a key when she was alive?" The mother hesitated. Then, because the people who could have freed her chose not to. They thought the empire was more important than one girl's freedom. But they were wrong, and now we leave keys to remember no empire is worth a child's terror. The girl thought about this. Then she pulled a small key from her backpack, her diary key, and placed it on the plaque. "Princess Layla can have mine. I'll get another one." Elif felt tears start and didn't stop them. Because that child understood something it had taken scholars years to articulate. The solution to inherited trauma isn't just acknowledgement. It's sacrifice. Giving up something you value, security, tradition, comfortable, lies to break a pattern that should never have started. In January 2022, the comprehensive book was published, The Architecture of Acceptable Trauma: How Empires Train Women to Endure. It was 847 pages of primary source documentation, psychological analysis, and cross-cultural comparison. The dedication read, "To the 237 named voices, the thousands of unnamed voices, and all who still carry the weight of silences they didn't create." The book became an unexpected bestseller, translated into 34 languages. Universities added it to required reading lists. Trauma therapy programs used it as a case study in systematic abuse. But the real impact was in living rooms and family conversations. People started asking different questions of their grandmothers, their aunts, their mothers. Started noticing patterns that suddenly made terrible sense. One review in The Atlantic captured it. "This book forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth, that trauma doesn't just destroy individuals, it shapes cultures. And until we trace those cultural patterns back to their violent origins, we'll keep perpetuating them while calling them tradition." By March 2022, the research team had documented similar conditioning systems in 7 historical empires spanning 4 continents. The techniques varied, but the core remained constant when women are political currency. They're trained to accept violence as duty. Professor Gould's team published their findings in a paper titled The Universal Architecture: How Power Structures Condition Compliance Across Cultures. The conclusion: the Ottoman sacred education wasn't an aberration, it was an example. And until we recognize these patterns wherever they appear, in royal courts, in religious institutions, and family structures, we'll keep building new versions of the same prison. In May 2022, on the 399th anniversary of Layla's wedding, a ceremony was held at the memorial. Over 5,000 people attended. The event was live-streamed to 1.2 million viewers across 40 countries. Elif, now Dr. Demir, with a completed PhD on the subject, gave the keynote address. 2 years ago, I found a journal with one word written in blood. Today, that word has become a movement. Not because we wanted to dishonor the Ottoman Empire, but because we needed to honor the women it damaged. There's a difference. She paused, looking at the bronze names. Some people ask, why dwell on the past? Why not move forward? And I say, because the past isn't past. It's living in our bodies, our families, our unconscious beliefs about what women should endure. You can't move forward while dragging ghosts. You have to face them. Name them, release them. So here's what I want everyone watching to understand. Princess Layla Sultan didn't die so we could feel sad. She died so we could feel responsible. Responsible for recognizing these patterns. Responsible for breaking them. Responsible for teaching the next generation that pain isn't normal, silence isn't virtue, and endurance isn't strength. It's just what we're forced to do when actual strength is stolen from us. The crowd was silent. Then someone started clapping. Then everyone. But in the middle of the applause, an elderly woman pushed through the crowd. She was crying. She carried a wooden box. Security tried to stop her. Elif waved them off. Let her through. The woman reached the stage, breathing hard. My name is Layla. I'm named after Princess Layla Sultan. I'm 83 years old, and I've been carrying this since my mother died. She opened the box. Inside a lock of hair, a child's bracelet, and a letter. My mother said this hair belonged to Princess Layla, that it had been kept by her daughter passed down through our family. She told me to wait until someone told the truth about what happened, to wait until it was safe to add to the story. The old woman's hands shook. I've been waiting 60 years. I think it's time. Elif took the box with trembling hands. Later, DNA analysis would confirm the hair was 17th century. It matched other samples authenticated as belonging to Layla Sultan. But it was the letter that broke everyone. Written in barely legible Ottoman Turkish, clearly by someone young. It was addressed to whoever I become. The letter read, I am 7 years old. My name is Layla. I can read 3 languages. I want to study stars. Today my mother told me I will be married when I turn 14. I don't know what that means, but everyone looks sad when they say it. If I grow up and forget who I am now, this is to remind me I was happy once. I asked questions. I laughed loud. I ran in gardens. Don't forget that girl, even if they make you. She was real. You were real. Elif read it aloud. By the end, there wasn't a dry eye in the crowd or among the viewers watching worldwide. Because that letter written by a 7-year-old who didn't yet know what was coming was the most devastating evidence yet. It showed consciousness, agency, a self that existed before the training, proof that what was done to her wasn't development. It was destruction. The letter was added to the permanent collection at the Istanbul Museum of Innocence in a new wing dedicated to documenting voices recovered from silence. That evening, Elif sat in her apartment surrounded by all the evidence they'd collected over 3 years. Journals, letters, keys, hair, DNA, testimonies, archaeological findings, descendant stories. She thought about Professor Ghoul's question from the beginning. What do we do with this knowledge? The answer was, we don't do one thing. We do everything. We memorialize so victims are remembered. We educate so patterns are recognized. We heal so trauma isn't perpetuated. We reform so systems can't replicate. We create new traditions that honor choice instead of destroying it. But most importantly, we refuse to forget, because forgetting is how it happens again. Elif pulled out her phone, opened social media, started recording. If you've watched this entire story, all 5 parts, you know now what was done to Princess Layla Sultan and 236 others. You know how systems justify violence as necessity. You know how trauma gets inherited like eye color. You know how long silence can survive when we're afraid to speak. She held up the 7-year-old Layla's letter to the camera. But you also know this: every system of violence requires our complicity, requires us looking away, requires us saying, that's just how things are. So here's what I'm asking: if you believe their names should be remembered, share this story. Write a name in the comments, not just the 237 princesses, but any woman in your own life whose voice was silenced, whose pain was dismissed, whose humanity was sacrificed for someone else's comfort. Because this isn't just Ottoman history. This is human history, and it doesn't end until we choose to end it, not by forgetting, by remembering so thoroughly that repetition becomes impossible. She ended the recording, posted it, went to bed. By morning, the video had 4.2 million views. The comments contained over 50,000 names. Women from every continent, every culture, every era. A global memorial written by witnesses who refuse to look away anymore. Among them, repeated thousands of times, Layla Sultan, Aisha Sultan, Mihrima Sultan. All 237 names from the bronze plaque, but also grandmother Elif, Aunt Zainab, my mother, my sister, me. The evidence had done what evidence does best. It made invisibility impossible. It turned private pain into public record. It transformed shame into witness. And somewhere in archives that would outlast empires and memories that would outlast forgetting and hearts that would outlast silence. Princess Layla. Sultan finally got what she'd asked for 399 years ago. Not forgiveness, not even justice. Just this, to be remembered as human. To to have her pain acknowledged as real, to know that her voice, however silenced, had eventually been heard. The empire that broke her was gone. But the girl who wrote "Forgive in blood" had become immortal, not as a symbol of piety, but as evidence of survival. Not as a lesson in obedience, but as a warning about the cost of demanding it. She'd wanted to study stars. Instead, she became one. A light in the darkness. Distant, but undeniable. Guiding others away from the systems that had consumed her. That's not the ending she deserved. But it's the only ending the dead can receive to be remembered, truly mourned properly, and learned from completely. 399 years after her wedding night, Princess Layla Sultan's scream was finally heard. Not as tragedy, as testimony. And testimony once spoken can never be silenced again.